So, good morning, everyone. My name is Elise James, and I am one of the technical education advisors that's working with the Association of Colleges and the Department for Education on the T-level transition program, which we abbreviate as TLTP. So if I'm using TLTP, today I'm referring to the T-level transition program. This is a technical focus group meeting. So the technical focus groups are part of the support program that the AOC is providing for this particular type of study program. But this technical focus group is targeted at those people that will be teaching the technical knowledge and skills component of the TLTP. So there are other events that take place that are for, say, transition leads, for other kinds of specialists, for quality managers, for people with different types of roles. So this one in particular is for the subject specialists. And so we focus very much on the subject content in this, in the technical focus groups, rather than anything that's much more about the kind of structure of the whole program or anything along those lines. So just to put that into context, because sometimes we have had people who may be head of department, but may not know anything about the subject content. And really, we are focused with these events on the subject content. We're expecting quite a lot of people today. And what we've been finding throughout the last 2 weeks, where we've been doing these events for different kind of routes, that people come in at various stages during the 2 hours, particularly within the first 10 minutes or so of the event starting, because often they, as you can imagine, and as many of you may have been, they're teaching at the beginning, or they are in meetings, and therefore they're moving from one room to another, logging in. So because we're expecting possibly up to 20, 30 people, not going to get you to introduce yourselves necessarily and go round. We've only got 2 hours, so we want to use the time as much as we can. But it would be helpful if you could put in the chat, perhaps where you're from. So some of you, I can see on your tile, your nameplate, you've actually put the college that you're from, which is great. So those of you that know how to change your nameplate, you can do that. You can do that by looking at your tile, pressing the 3 dots, and it'll ask you if you want to change your name, which means you can put that on, or if you just want to put it in chat, because one of the things we want to get out of today is to give you the opportunity to kind of collaborate and network. So yes, I am going to be giving some presentations, but it's really important from our point of view that you get the opportunity to talk to each other and see whether or not there's an opportunity for you to network and collaborate after this event. So seeing where other people are based can often help you in terms of maybe making contact directly with that person and trying to arrange meetings afterwards. Got various people supporting me today, and you can see those on the tile that have got the AOC backgrounds. So they are the advisors that are supporting providers that are delivering the TLTP and the T-level. And they're going to be supporting today because at various stages throughout the day, we'll be going into breakout rooms so that you can have more discussion in small groups. And they're going to be in those breakout rooms supporting you to do that. Predominantly, they are here to take notes so that I can focus on you, your conversations, your questions, give you answers, give you direction. So they're going to be taking notes of the kind of questions that you're coming up with, so that we can use them to put them together into a frequently asked questions document that can then be shared with other providers. So I'm going to be using a slide deck. The slide deck is going to be made available to you after the event, and you probably got a message that this is being recorded, and that recording is also going to be made available to you after the event, and those frequently asked questions are also going to be made available to you after the event. Becky is just going to say a little bit about the role of the advisor, because some of you may not have met your advisors, and Becky's description of the role may suggest that after this, you do want to find out who your advisor is and how you might want to make contact with them. So Becky, do you want to just briefly say what you're doing?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Nice to see some familiar faces and some familiar names in here. I am a T-level transition program advisor, and myself, alongside Richard, Tony, Lauren and Nick in this group, and the rest of the wider team, we support providers in planning and delivering their transition programs. So we have termly meetings with either a transition program lead or a lot of the time maybe senior leaders, and we ask questions and pose those sort of challenges as to how the program is being developed. And we also keep you updated on events and webinars that are happening as well that would be useful. So each provider that is planning a transition program has an advisor assigned to them. Like I said, you may not necessarily know who that is, but if you're interested and you want to be a part of that process, because it is really useful to get different departments together, then feel free just to pop it in the chat and ask the question, and we can find out who your advisor is and make sure they're aware that you've been asked as well, or that you've asked, sorry.
Thanks, Becky. Okay, so thanks for those of you that have put details in the chat, and that's really helpful as well to know where we've got groups of people together. So Carla, Tony, I think it's Helen from Havant and South Downs. So useful to know that you're all together. At this stage, don't need you to put cameras on, but it is really nice for those of you that are keeping your cameras on, so that at least I know that I'm talking to someone, but also appreciate that we've had this before, that people, they're on these calls, it's predominantly in the background. Sometimes you're still delivering a class, so we appreciate it's not that straightforward to be able to put your cameras on. But I think once you go into the breakout rooms, it will be really beneficial to the discussion if you can put your cameras on. So I probably am speaking at the moment directly to those that I can see. So apologies if you've not got your cameras on, if you don't feel that I'm contacting you. So just let me talk a little bit about what we're going to do today. So you should have had some details with a slide deck which gives an overview of the T-level transition program, the TLTP, but I'm just going to go over some key points because I think it's really important to set that in context. But the main focus of today, as given in the kind of introduction to the session and the marketing information, is about the national technical outcomes, which are part of the TLTP. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the outcome statements themselves so that you can understand the importance of those, and then look at what teaching and learning means. Now, we're aware that probably none of you have yet started your T-level transition program, because it doesn't really start until you are already delivering your T-level. But we do know that some providers like to start with some kind of pilot, and therefore there may be aspects of the TLTP that you are delivering. If anybody is delivering at the moment, if you can let us know through the chat, that'd be really helpful. So how we might be able to use your experiences. So from our point of view, most of you are in the planning stage. And actually using the NTOs is a useful starting point for your planning. And I'll talk more about that as we go through. So the focus is about the NTOs. So what we're expecting is that you engage, that ideally you're using the chat, but many of you will probably know that Zoom has a number of reactions buttons that you can use. So smiley faces, thumbs up, hands up. So if you can find the reactions button, if you do want to speak, if you use the hands up, then I'll know, because it will come up in front of me, that you're wanting to ask a question. As much as I can, I'll keep an eye on the tiles that are in front of me. And if I can see people have taken their mic off mute, that would also suggest to me that you want to engage and you want to ask a question. But if you're asking a question, put them in the chat. If I notice them, I will refer to it in the presentation. One of my colleagues from AOC may well put an answer in, but also whilst you're in your breakout rooms or during breaks or something like that, I'll go back through all the questions that are in the chat, and we'll make sure that we cover them either through the session today or through some kind of follow-up email that we send out. So when you get the email with all the details about the slide decks and everything, we'll make sure that any questions we haven't been able to cover we'll be covering today. What we're not here to do today is debate policy, and we're not here today to debate the content of the NTOs. So everything that we're looking at today is already being approved, and this is what is expected to be out there. So there are lots of opportunities, as I've said, for discussions, but there are also presentations And as I've said, if you have got questions, please do ask them as we go through. So just to point out then the aims of today, it's a focus on the framework for delivery. We've put revised in there because we've been using this slide deck for all of the routes. Some of the routes you see have been running for some time. There's been a new framework for delivery. So from their point of view, it's important they see that as revised and different to what they've been looking at. From your point of view, the framework for delivery is the framework for delivery, okay, unless you've been involved in running a transition program for other routes. But as I've said, mostly it's to enable you to explore the NTOs and your approaches to teaching, learning and formative assessment. Because as when we start to look at the NTOs, and many of you have probably realised there's no kind of assessment requirements specified in relation to those, but we're going to talk about what that might mean for formative assessment. And then towards the end, we're also going to look at what's available to you and how you can plan for next steps through the kind of support that we've got available. So let's go over the background and making sure that you've got that kind of overview of the key principles and purpose of the transition programme. So as it states on there, the key purpose is to prepare students for progression onto and success on a T-level. So the whole study programme has been designed for that one specific purpose. Now, we know that some providers have decided that they don't want to offer this transition programme to support students that are making progression to a T-level, and that's up to them. This isn't necessarily the right thing for every provider based on the kind of students that they are attracting that are not yet ready for a T-level. So the transition programme is for those that want to do a T-level but are not yet ready. We also know that there are providers where they don't have the numbers in their cohort to be able to offer a transition programme study programme and a normal level 2 study programme. And some of them therefore choose that the transition programme is the programme that everybody is using. And again, that's fine, but it's important to remember that the purpose of the T-level transition programme is to prepare students for transition to a T-level. So it's important that throughout the rest of the day, rest of the session, sorry, you don't have to think about it in the afternoon, it's not the law, but throughout this session, you remember that this is the purpose, this is why it's been designed. And therefore, when you're making decisions about whether or not you want to run this programme, that is what you need to consider, is its purpose. So some of the principles that are there, therefore, that you would need to include when you're developing your transition programme, if you decide to go ahead with one, is ensuring that you prepare students for what they will experience on T-levels. So one of the things that we've identified from those that have made a success of their transition programme is how they have developed their transition programme with those that are developing their T-levels, so that there's a real understanding and synergy between the two. So that you're developing, once you know how you're going to approach your T-levels, the kind of teaching and learning strategies, the kind of formative assessment strategies, the kind of employer engagement experiences they're having, then this is the kind of thing that can inform what you're going to do on your T-level transition programme. So it's important, therefore, not to develop the two, ideally, in isolation of each other, because otherwise, how can you prepare students for what they're going to experience on the T-level if you don't know what they're going to experience on the T-level? And this is part of what should happen on the transition programme. Another of the principles is that students need to develop core knowledge, skills and behaviours. And I've got in the next slide, we're going to talk more about those. But the key thing there when we're talking about core knowledge, skills and behaviours, it's about those that apply regardless of the route. So this isn't about core in terms of maybe some kind of mandatory content or mandatory unit, core unit that you're used to seeing, or core content that you see on a T-level. If you like, it's about generic knowledge, skills and behaviours. And those are kind of really critical, important aspects that make the transition programme different to other study programmes, because it's acknowledged that traditionally or typically students that are on a transition programme are on that programme because they don't have those kind of study skills, learning skills, attributes that support them to be able to cope with level 3 study. And therefore, these core knowledge, skills and behaviours are critical to be able to do this. It's important that students are clear about what they need to achieve, so that at the outset, students know what they need to do in order to get onto a T level. So the critical thing there in terms of getting onto a T level, you need to consider if those are your direct entry requirements. Really, from an equity point of view, should you be having different entry requirements for students that are on a transition programme? So, for example, if you were insisting that students have to do and complete a 4 GCSE size qualification and achieve that to a merit level, which is higher than a level 4 in a GCSE, and you want English and maths, then essentially you're saying that they have to have 6 GCSEs, 4 of which are above a grade 4. But if your direct entry only requires them to have 5 GCSEs at grade 4, then essentially what you're saying is the transition programme. So students that are with you for a year have to have higher entry requirements than those that you don't know. So it's important, therefore, to consider what it is that you're wanting students to achieve in order to progress onto a T level. And that might be partly what you look at from the point of view of the NTOs, and when you're looking at qualifications and what those qualifications might be. The key thing is that the transition programme should be seen as a holistic programme. Now, it's acknowledged that for most of the students on the transition programme, the reason that they're there is that they don't have their maths and English at the grade that you need for them to be able to get onto the T level. And it's also acknowledged that some of that teaching needs to be compartmentalised so that they're fully prepared for resitting their GCSEs and being successful in those GCSEs. But it's also expected that those English and maths skills that they're developing through that GCSE content timetable is also incorporated into the delivery of a more holistic programme. And the core knowledge, skills and behaviours that I've referred to are also part of a holistic programme, so that students don't have a timetable that says, this is where your knowledge is, this is where your contextualisation of maths is, this is where your experience of the workplace is, this is where your technical knowledge and skills is, that predominantly they should see this is where your programme is, and that the timetable reflects that. So ultimately, the idea is through this programme, they are able to make the right decision about what to do after the programme. So it acknowledges not every student on completion is right for a T level, and that the student can see that that is the case because their experience has suggested to them the T level maybe isn't the right thing for me anymore. Maybe I'm better to get an apprenticeship. Maybe it's better for me to try and get a job. But the programme allows them to make that decision, and that it's the right decision for them, and that you're working with them in order to be able to make that right decision. So Jess, you're asking, I can see in the chat, around progress to a T level and how this impacts on success rates. I don't have that kind of detail. I'm really sorry, because this is just an overview and a focus on the NTOs. It is something that the department are really interested in looking at, the number of students that are on a transition programme that are progressing to the T level. And it may be that the advisors can give more feedback, and maybe in the chat, if one of you can answer that and put that in as they go through this. So in terms of qualifications, the whole purpose and principles of the T-level transition programme is covered in the framework for delivery. It says in the framework delivery, you can use a qualification or non-qualification approach to this, and you can decide if you are going to use a qualification approach, whether or not you want one qualification, more than one qualification, and what type of qualification and what level of qualification you want that to include. This is something that's entirely up to you. And one of the reasons why I'm saying that today and a focus on the NTOs is a really good start to the planning is, rather than necessarily choosing a qualification first and then start thinking about the NTOs, you might want to get your head around the NTOs. And if you want a qualification, find a qualification that matches the NTOs as far as is possible. So it's important to think about that. And the Ofqual register, and it's easy to find on Google, just type in Ofqual register and it comes up. That's where every qualification is listed, and you can refine it by level. So if you're wanting a level 3 or if you're wanting a level 2, you can refine it by level, you can refine it by sector. You can have a technical qualification, so something that's agriculture, environment, animal care related, or you can have something that's non-technical, like a project qualification, or a broad employability skills qualification, or a first aid qualification. So you can have general qualifications, you can have something that is technical in its nature. All of this is entirely flexible, and it's up to you. And it goes back to that principle about being clear what they need to achieve. We have providers that do 1 level 3 unit, and the student gets a certificate for the 1 level 3 unit, and they take the year to develop and work towards that 1 level 3 unit, or a level 3 award, which might have 2 units. So it's a small qualification. They spend the whole year working towards that small qualification, and at the end they get something that's level 3. So there's lots of different approaches that they can take in terms of the qualifications that they're taking. And that is something that the other events, or talking to your advisor, you'll learn more about, because they can give you information about what others are doing. Although obviously from this route's perspective, then that's something that people are still in the process of kind of thinking through. So as I've mentioned, principles are around core knowledge, skills and behaviours. So this slide sets out, in summary, those core knowledge, skills and behaviours. And these are in more detail in the framework for delivery. And we've sent the links to the framework for delivery. So if you haven't had a chance to read that, I recommend that you do look through that, because that tells you more information about these core skills, knowledge and behaviours. So they are organised into 5 key areas. So students on the transition programme are expected to cover these core skill areas, and in the framework for delivery it tells you more detail about what is expected to be covered within these 5 core areas. So positive attitudes and behaviours. So again, part of a holistic programme, real opportunity to bring in positive attitudes and behaviours by teaching something technical, by teaching something related to agriculture or animal care or the environment, by bringing in those kind of professional behaviours that we want in the students to be able to develop. As I've mentioned, English and maths we know is likely to be taught separately as they prepare for the GCSE, but we would also expect, where there's naturally occurring opportunities, that it's taught through the content, through the main programme as well. And in addition to English and maths, also digital skills, so that students are developing their digital skills so that they're ready for the workplace and they're prepared for the workplace. Critically, as part of the transition programme, is the skills for successful study. These are really, really important from the department's perspective, and it's something that we're learning more and more about from those that are delivering the transition programme, how these are really lacking in students. One of the reasons that they haven't been successful in school is they don't have the skills for successful study. So it's really, really critical that those are part of their programme. But again, it shouldn't be that's an hour on their timetable. It should be that's something that's integrated into a holistic programme. Knowledge and skills for the workplace. So that's about technical skills, but employability skills as well. And also industry relevant technical knowledge and skills. So yes, and the technical bit is the bit that's related to the agriculture, environment and animal care, the route that's related to the T levels. So that's the background to those core skills, and you'll need to look at your framework for delivery to find out more about those. But one of the things that you'll find when we're looking at the NTOs, if you haven't had a chance to look and notice already, is you'll see how many of those aspects of the core knowledge, skills and behaviours are already incorporated into the NTOs. So we've already started to look at ways in which you can incorporate and make a holistic transition programme that incorporates those core KSBs. So in addition to those core KSBs, you're also expected to deliver 6 components that are part of a holistic program. So the previous diagram is referred to as the donut diagram. This one is the Venn diagram, to show that kind of interrelationship between the different components that exist. And again, that's because it's expected to be holistic and that students don't get on their timetable something that shows each of these components in isolation. The expectation is that they are all integrated together. The weighting that you give to those components should actually depend on the student needs. So the whole basis of having a flexible transition program is to allow you to be responsive to individual student needs. So the weighting of these components may depend on the student that perhaps needs more time for English, maths, digital skills, may have more weighting on that than the technical knowledge and skills component. So if we've got a student that you've accepted on your transition program because they haven't got their maths, but they have got their English, then they may have more time on one of the other components integrated within the whole program. So the weighting that you give will vary according to the type of student that you've got on your program. So let's have a look at the national technical outcomes. The national technical outcomes are part of the technical knowledge and skills component. But as I've mentioned, within those NTOs, we also have elements of the other components and core knowledge, skills and behaviours. So the technical knowledge and skills component, one of the 6 components, is to give students a broad introduction to a T-level route. Okay, so it isn't about specific occupational competency and occupational specialism. Other study programs can provide students with that introduction, with that development opportunity. That is not what the transition program is for. So again, if you feel your students need something that is more occupationally specific, you might want to put them onto a traditional study program. The transition program is about a broad introduction to a T-level route. So the route, which is agriculture, environment and animal care management. So these are route-based outcomes. This is about it being technical knowledge and skills so that it's a strong motivator for students to keep them engaged and interested. So it isn't, as I said, about developing occupational competency. It's about having a hook on which everything else can be placed. So it isn't about ensuring students meet any kind of occupational competency. There's no standards set for the NTOs. It is just content. So the idea is it's content upon which you can hang the core knowledge, skills and behaviours and the other components. And that's why they've been selected, why that particular content has been selected, as it provides the opportunity for that holistic programme. A key thing is that this is not expected to be the largest part of the programme, which suggests that if you are going to have a qualification, it needs to be a relatively small qualification that is less than half of the overall programme. So depending on the total hours you've got for your study programme, you're probably looking at something that's 240 guided learning hours, maybe a little bit bigger would be appropriate. So that gives students a 2 GCSE equivalent qualification alongside their English and maths. And one of the things that we're finding, and you'll probably find as well, if you look at your data for your level 2 students, they've already got some GCSEs. They just haven't got the number and the English and maths to get on the T level. So when you look at the kind of nature of the cohort, a 2 GCSE equivalent with English and maths, along with what they've already got, should give them what they need in order to be able to access your T-level programme. That's something that you'll be looking at individually. So it's not expected to be the largest part of the programme. The national technical outcomes, the NTOs, are actually designed to be about 120 to 150 guided learning hours. So for those of you that are looking at a non-qualification approach, or you're looking at a different type of qualification approach, then the NTOs still fit as a small part of an overall program that you can use as a hook. If you are looking at a qualification, then it's important that you think about qualifications that support the achievement of the outcomes in the NTOs, and that's what we're going to be focusing on in a moment. So the purpose of the NTOs is to provide some consistency around the content, so that nationally we know that as a minimum, everybody on a particular transition program has covered this particular content. And the content has been chosen through meetings with different providers, focus groups and employer focus groups, looking at existing level 2 qualifications, looking at the T-level outline content, and looking at from that outline content that's at level 3 and identifying kind of concepts, theories, principles that students might find challenging when if they go straight onto a T-level, and therefore having a basic introduction to them should give them confidence to be able to engage with that content and move beyond that kind of basic introduction. So they've been tested with a range of providers and with employers, and actually with wider stakeholders such as maths and English specialists, to ensure that they provide that kind of content upon which you can hang your core knowledge, skills and behaviours. There's in the NTOs, and we'll look at these in more detail, you have minimum content and you have the opportunity for breadth and depth. And I'll talk a bit more detail about the breadth and depth, but that's in a separate section. So you've got the minimum content, which is your 120 to 150 guided learning hours. That's equivalent to 1 GCSE. And then you've got the breadth and depth. So if you want to add to that yourself to provide stretch and challenge, the breadth and depth have some examples, but they are not the only examples. You can come up with your own examples as well, because remember, this is a flexible program. So we've got the minimum content for consistency, and then you can add to that in terms of anything else that you want. So any questions before we start looking at the NTOs in more detail that people want to ask, where you're going to put your hand up and ask? Can't see anything. Fine. Move on. So this is an opportunity for you to find your national technical outcomes and maybe have them open in front of you, or have your hard copy in front of you, so that as I talk about the structure of them, you're able to look at them and you can see what it is that I'm talking about. So I can see people picking them up. Thank you. So key thing is, the first thing, once you've got past the introductory page, you'll find that it sets out the outcomes themselves. So generally qualifications have some kind of learning outcomes, but certainly for most people, they don't really look at the learning outcome, they look at the assessment requirements. For the NTOs, because it's the content and it's no assessment, then the outcomes are really, really important in terms of planning your teaching and learning, because the outcomes, as the title suggests, set out what the student should be able to do on completion of learning the content. So the outcome, if you like, is going to be your formative assessment requirement. This is how you will know that the students have learned what they should have learned, because they will be able to do what the outcome says they should be able to do. So within this route, most of the outcomes are performance outcomes, as in they are doing activities, things they have to do. So they are task related. You also have a learning outcome which is more theoretical. So your first one is quite theoretical. Okay, we're going to focus more on the performance outcomes today. So the reason that we're using performance outcomes is that link to T-levels, because T-level content is also structured around performance outcomes. So as you're preparing your T-level, you're getting your head around what a performance outcome is. Then you and your transition program students are also getting their head around what a performance outcome is. So we're using the same kind of structure that you find within the T-levels. So it's that bit about preparing them for what they will experience on the T-levels. Then for each performance outcome, when you get to the performance outcomes, so that's 2 and 3A and 3B, you'll find that under the performance outcome and the rationale, you've got 2 columns, one of which is knowledge, the other of which is skills. Okay, again, the same way as the outline content is set out for your route. So mirroring what's happening with T-levels. So the idea is the knowledge has been chosen because it's the knowledge that they need in order to achieve the outcome. The skills are the skills they need to be able to demonstrate to meet the outcome. And the theory and the practice need to work together in order to meet the outcome. So the expectation is that this knowledge and these skills are taught together holistically so that students see the relationship between theory and practice and can demonstrate that relationship when meeting the outcomes. So the technical and employability skills that are in the skills section will include maths and English under the headings of communication and numeracy. And if you look under the skills, communication and numeracy, you'll find that there's some referencing to GCSE and functional skills in English and maths as well. So it's the skills that are naturally occurring for English and maths or for communication and numeracy that are required to be able to show that they've met the outcome. But we're indicating how that is contextualizing what they are learning in their GCSE or functional skills English and maths classes. So these are really good signposts for you as a kind of early activity to go to your maths and English departments and find out what this means, what they are teaching, and what the techniques are. Because what we don't want, these students would struggle if you start teaching these kind of maths and English skills in a different way to the way the GCSE and functional skills people are teaching it. These are opportunities to reinforce what they are learning in their GCSE maths and English, and for your maths and English people to know contexts in which they can teach those skills. But it's really important that students practice the techniques they need for their GCSE and functional skills, because otherwise they're missing marks, and that could be what's meaning they're missing their results for their GCSE maths and English. So that referencing is there specifically to help you to work with your maths and English departments and find out exactly what that means I should be teaching the student to do when I'm getting them to do these maths and English skills, these communication and numeracy skills. We've also indicated where there are digital skills that are naturally occurring in order to be able to meet the outcome. And there's some reference in there as well. And that reference is to level 1 digital skills qualifications, either in essential digital skills or the new functional skills in IT level 1 qualifications. Yes, it's level 1, but it's a qualification that confirms the level of digital skills, that they have some digital skills that are available. There's no functional skills in IT at level 2, but there might be other level 2 IT qualifications that you might want to offer students when you look at the range of digital skills that students can develop through these NTOs that would give students a digital qualification. So that's one of those that's not necessarily technical, as in agriculture and animal care related, but is still a qualification that might be equivalent to half a GCSE or a full GCSE or something like that, which is all adding up. Might even be that there's a level 3 digital qualification that they can come away with, which would be really useful. Something like a Microsoft, a vendor qualification, something like that, that is valued out in industry. Also, you'll find that there's a section on behaviours. So those behaviours are what employers consider to be really important. So again, part of that holistic programme, thinking about how are you going to develop those behaviours. So employers have said, these are the behaviours that we think are naturally occurring to meet this outcome. Therefore, direct naturally occurring opportunities to develop those skills, those attributes, those behaviours in students. So that's what you're going to find when you look at the whole of the national technical outcomes. Any questions about the structure of the NTOs? Okay, so let's just look at the performance outcomes, because we're going to have an activity in a minute where you're going to look at the outcomes themselves. So remember, the outcomes is what you're getting students to learn that they can do. So essentially, these are your formative assessment tasks. Okay, so we are going to expect students to demonstrate that they can propose enterprising solutions to agriculture, environmental, and animal care business development. Okay, so that's the first outcome. Well, it's the first in the list that's a performance outcome. It might be your last performance outcome if you organize them in that kind of outcome by outcome way. So essentially, that is going to be their assignment task. The next one is either apply technical skills to maintain the health and welfare of animals, or apply technical skills to support plant development in their environments. So students choose one or the other, or you choose that you're going to focus for your transition program students that everybody does 3B or everybody does 3A, or it might be that you provide both choices and students can choose from one or the other. So you can see that that is very practical. So they're applying their technical skills either to health and welfare of animals or supporting plant development. So that's linked more to the way that the T levels go, in that one is much more about the kind of agriculture side, the land side, the other is much more related to the animal side, whereas outcome 2 is much more broad and much more route-based for you to consider. So those are the performance outcomes. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is to give some thought to, well, what does that actually mean I'm going to ask students to do? So if I'm going to ask them to apply technical skills to maintain the health and welfare of animals, exactly what am I going to ask the student to do so that I can confirm that they can apply technical skills to maintain the health and welfare of animals? Don't worry about the content at the moment. Just worry about, what does that outcome mean to you? If you want to look at outcome 2 and you're thinking, what am I going to ask the student to do if I'm asking them to propose enterprising solutions to agriculture, environmental, and animal care business development? Firstly, you might want to shorten that a little bit, but it might be something like, here is a business, here are some difficulties they're facing, or here's an opportunity. How might they be able to deal with that challenge? How might they deal with the issue that they're facing? Come up with some kind of proposals. So this is the kind of thing that we're looking at. If it's applied technical skills to maintain the health and welfare of animals, I don't know, are you going to get them to go into the stable and do something in the stable? This is not my background. You probably gathered that. So if I'm using the wrong words sometimes or coming up with the wrong ideas, I've worked closely with Jess and some of you before, so you know about this, so ignore me. Just as I said stable, I was thinking, I'm sure that's where horses are, but because it's near Christmas, it started making me think like mangers and things, and whether or not I've actually got too caught up in nativity and what have you, so apologies for that. So getting you to think about what this might actually mean you're going to get students to do so that you can confirm that they have met the outcome. So my colleague in a minute has organised randomly for you to go into breakout rooms. Now, where I can see that there's different people in a room, just choose one of them to go into, and it may well be that you've all been allocated a different room to go into. So you'll have a breakout room to go into where I want you to spend 10 minutes thinking about one or more of these outcomes and what do you think that means you're actually going to ask the student to do, okay? Without looking at the content, just looking at the outcome. What is it that you want students to do? My colleagues from AOC will be there. They may ask you to introduce themselves, but predominantly it's about your discussion, and they then are just going to take notes on what you're discussing. You'll get a message before the end of 10 minutes. Somebody's going to have to come back and feedback on your behalf. But in a minute on the screen, you'll be getting the opportunity to go and join a breakout room. I'll nip in and see whether or not you're talking to each other. But on the whole, I'm just going to leave this up to you for you to have the discussion, and then we'll see what you come up with when you come back. So Abby should be put in the breakout rooms. Ta-da! Perfect. So just press join, you'll be in the breakout rooms, and I'll see you in 10 minutes or so. Great, I think we've got all of the rooms back now. Just let me check. Yes, got everybody back now, thank you. I was able to just nip into rooms. I didn't want to interrupt, but everybody, there was always talking, which is great, and people with cameras off. So nice to see people that I hadn't seen yet. Just really interested to hear any of the kind of key points you were talking about, because I know when I was going in the room, you weren't necessarily talking about what I'd asked you to talk about, but that was expected. So just interested to hear what you were talking about. So the A team, apparently, Helen. Let's
That's
go
the
with
whole
you.
room. So that was
Exactly.
us.
Everybody else can just sit back now, because the self-labeled A team are going to tell us what they.
Oh no, that was a big mistake, guys, wasn't it? No, so we talked about how between us we have experience of delivering Sitting Guilds technicals at levels 2 and 3 and BTECs at levels 2 and 3. So a lot of what we're already delivering in terms of the practical application of knowledge, so getting students to demonstrate that they know how to do the animal husbandry, that they can health check animals, they can handle them, they can clean them out and feed them appropriately. We would use those practical sessions to practically assess the knowledge. One of the things we were just sort of trying to work out is how, because for outcome 3, it's now very clear you can go 3A or 3B, but even in outcome 1, there's quite a lot of plant and animal crossover, and we weren't sure whether there was the option to pick and choose a bit out of that, or whether you had to cover everything in as much detail. So we did go a little bit off piste from your set mission, sorry Elise, and to talk about that, because we sort of covered how we'd practically assess them quite quickly, and then we sort of got on to outcome 1 and whether there's any sort of sliding scale of how much you cover for your different areas, or do you wait until you get to outcome 3 to diverge?
Yeah, so I mean, just to briefly mention in terms of outcome 1, the outcome, which is to apply the knowledge, because it's a learning outcome, it's theory. You can teach it if you want to, some of the content through the other outcomes. So a lot of the science obviously would help with their maintenance of health and welfare of animals and the development of supporting the plant development in their environment. So the way you deliver the content is up to you. Ultimately, you have to demonstrate, or you have to get the student to demonstrate that they can meet that outcome. So in reality, that as an outcome probably needs to be assessed, if you like, in its own, probably using some kind of exam that you've put together. And it would need to cover all of the content, or sample from the content, but not sample in terms of, from an assessment point of view, not only sample the animal side, but taking each of the bullet points and kind of asking a question around each of the bullet points would be the key thing to be able to look at from that point of view. When you're looking at outcome 2, all of the content should be taught. So you should have something, and that's what your quality team should be looking for, is how are you showing that you are teaching all of this minimum content? Okay, now where there's a for example, it's for example. You might choose a different example. You might only have one example. You might have there's 3 in there, but they are only there as examples. So if you took all the examples out, you're left with a minimum content that you have to cover. And the level below that you decide to go to is up to you. So you have to have evidence that you have taught all of this content. And then when you're making your judgment about whether or not they've met the outcome, you should be designing the assessment to enable at least all of the bold headings and something from all of the bold headings to be incorporated into that assessment outcome, okay, that you've covered it. So we wouldn't expect, in the way that you would do with a qualification, there's nothing about assessment. So how you do assessment is entirely up to you, okay? But policy and the expectations of DFE is the whole basis of the transition program is about learning, okay? Not about assessment, and definitely not about summative assessment. Formative assessment that is used to help the student to learn. So, for example, if they're working once a week, looking after the animal environment, or working in the garden area or the field or whatever, working with plants and whatever it is, you know, if the first time they do that, they're not very good, which is likely, isn't it? Then that's a formative assessment opportunity where you're able to give them feedback on how they've used their knowledge, how they've applied their knowledge, the level of skill that they've got. There's no issue with students doing whatever you decide is the assessment on lots and lots of different times, okay? And because it's not about, this is your one opportunity to show that you can meet this outcome. Because remember, the whole principle about this is not about the technical knowledge and skills. Because you potentially are going to be recruiting people onto a T-level direct from school who have no technical knowledge and skills. So this isn't about the technical knowledge and skills. This is about them learning about themselves, you learning about them, you supporting them to be better learners, and using these outcomes as a way to show the students how well they're progressing as individual students, how well they are progressing in terms of their learning, and where they may need extra help and support about the next one. So if you want to give them feedback that says this is wrong, this would be the right answer, if you think that's the right way to help them, you can. If you're doing that on a BTEC, you can't. So because this isn't about summative assessment. So this is about something that's very different from the qualification that they're doing. This is about the learning. And that's therefore important to think about. So those naturally occurring opportunities that you currently have in your teaching, and it's working, why wouldn't you use them as part of your transition program? If it's good learning, it's good learning. And the content has been selected because it supports good learning and it supports engaging and motivating students. Some of it might not be. Some of it you might say, well, that's not going to be engaging to the students. And it's kind of, yeah, but they're going to have to learn it because they're going to have to do it on the T-level. And part of what they need to realise, and I know in one of the rooms I was in, they were talking a lot about business. Business is quite a big part of their T-level. Therefore, they need to see, actually, I don't like anything about business. I don't want to do the T-level. I want to do something else. Or I've loved the business. I want to do the T-level in business now, not the T-level in agriculture. So it's part of the wider thing that they get from it. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, but it's got to cover the content. You've got to show that you teach the content. And this is what we're saying is try and get your head around the NTOs before you decide on your qual. And then look for a qual that best matches the NTOs. And ideally, best matches the outcomes in the NTOs, because that way you've got lots of formative assessment and practice where you can give them lots and lots of feedback before they do the summative assessment for their qual. And the summative assessment for the qual, if it's like the outcomes, then they're prepared for that. And that means that then you're supporting them to get that qualification, which then improves their self-confidence and their ability to engage when they move on to the level 3 as well. Okay. So lots of you will have environments in where outcome 3A and 3B can work, because you're probably already delivering something related to this. Okay, what about another room? Who wants to volunteer something about what they were talking about in another room? Anybody?
In our breakout room, people were saying that they were probably going to continue running their level 2 technical alongside, so that's the qualification they'll come out with. But the kind of banding and the assessment and the outcomes of that work really well with the TLTP, because it's kind of poor to limited, limited to good, good to excellent. So it provides that stretch and challenge within the TLTP, but still actually helps them achieve that technical qualification. And then it's all about the synoptic assessments and kind of naturally occurring and things like that, which is what the City and Guilds Level 2 technical is anyway, so they marry up quite nicely.
And I think that's the case, isn't it? That's what I'm saying is look at your NTOs, and we have a lot of providers that, for the others that have been running this, they did the mapping of the content, they didn't do the mapping against the outcomes, and that's why we're focusing the first bit of today, getting people to look at what the outcomes are. If your qualification naturally requires them to meet those outcomes, then that's fine. But if it doesn't, then you've got additional assessment opportunities that you're going to have to create, and additional content. And if you're choosing a technical, which is 360 guided learning hours, and it doesn't cover some of the content and these outcomes, you need to take into account the additional time that you're going to need. And typically in the qual, there may be some technical skills, but the other skills in the NTOs, the ones that link to the core skills and behaviours, you won't find in qualifications. They are rarely in qualifications. The behaviours are rarely in qualifications. So that means when you've got your 360 guided learning hour qual, you're going to have to think about, well, how much extra time am I going to need for the NTOs? And then on top of that, the rest of the core knowledge, skills and behaviours that aren't in the NTOs. So ensuring and thinking when you're planning about your bigger programme, all of those requirements. So really getting your head around the framework for delivery. Where is all of that coming in your qualification? And that might mean you've got to deliver your qualification in a slightly different way in order to be able to deliver it within the total time that you've been allocated. And also, critically, talking to your senior leadership team who think that you can deliver your technical qualification in the guided learning hours of the qualification if you have identified, no, we need time to deliver this other content that's in the NTOs that's not in the qual, and time to get them to work on the outcomes, which is not in the qual. So you've really got to spend a lot of time thinking about what the qual is and what that means to the overall programme, and what that means to the time that is allocated to you to be able to deliver the technical content, remembering that the technical content is supposed to be the smallest part. So if you're choosing a 360 guided learning hours qual, and if it's going to be the smallest part, then that means your overall study programme is going to be bigger than 720 guided learning hours. Okay, because the qual's got to be the smallest part. The technical component's got to be the smallest part. It's not supposed to be the largest part. All of this is in the framework for delivery. So it's worth talking to your leadership team, your transition lead, about what their expectations are, and potentially asking them, if that's what you're wanting us to do, how are we going to meet these other requirements of the framework for delivery? What are your quality team looking for? Because they're going to be looking for something not just about the qual, because the study programme, the transition study programme, requires something more than the qual. There's a lot more quality aspects to consider to see how you're covering all of those different components and how you're covering all the core knowledge, skills and behaviours. We've tried where we can to bring some of those into the NTOs where they're naturally occurring, but there's lots of other things where they're not naturally occurring, and therefore you've got to add them to it and find a way of integrating it into your delivery. So good point, Rhiannon, and thanks for pointing that out. And that's where many people are looking, and understand why with the technicals, particularly the City and Guilds and the way they're structured, they can work quite well for NTOs in general, but you probably are going to have to add more hours to that. And then it's got implications for what does that mean for their whole study programme, and whether or not the funding actually allows for all of that time within the study programme. It's not bad them having a big study programme, is it? Because their T-level is a big study programme. So if you're preparing them for a T-level, the fact you're getting them in 4 days a week and not 2.5 days a week is not a bad thing. So that's not a bad thing as long as it can be funded. And I'm sure people like Jess and others would then be asking me questions, and I don't know the answer about funding. So that's where your advisors might be able to give you more details or more direction. Anybody else want to talk about what they were discussing in their group? Claire.
We looked at them as completely separate NTOs. So we obviously acknowledged that the 3A was very much very similar to like your synoptics that we do at the minute. So it's about that kind of ongoing assessment, developing of learners, developing of their skills, covering a range of animals, but obviously, you know, in that acknowledgement of the fact that they are very similar to the synoptics at the moment, that could be something obviously you embed and look at. But again, it's then looking at the behaviours and the other competencies that we need to get in there, and how we're going to kind of assess and make sure that we are confident that those learners can deliver on those afterwards. We did look at outcome 2 as well, where, and again, looked at it as a separate NTO, and again, acknowledged that it was quite similar to one of the business modules, but kind of discussed how it would really need contextualizing. For me, this is definitely something that the learners would be less engaged with potentially, so we would need to make sure that it was right for them. So not necessarily giving them one particular scenario, but giving them a number of that they could choose, and also not just making it a one kind of standalone assessment, looking at building a portfolio of evidence to capture those again digital kind of English and maths bits that we're looking at, to show their level of research, to show where they've got it from, to then look at the behaviours associated with getting them ready for that next T level as well. You know, maybe potentially getting them at the end to do a presentation. So they've done a portfolio of evidence, but then get them to present it, looking at the behaviours that we're looking for, ready to then sell themselves when they get onto the T level for their industry placement and that sort of thing. So again, very, very holistic, but we did look at them as standalone NTOs, not looking at, you know, actually going into and getting another qualification, which is definitely an option, but we looked at it kind of to encompass everything.
Yeah, and I think outcome 2 and outcome 3, whether it's A or B, you could have them kind of holistically in terms of this is the enterprising solution, now do something to put it in place. So it's kind of one project, if you like, that are there. Or it could be, here's a project that actually is related to a local employer in the sector that we want you to look at. And then separately, here is something in the way that Helen was talking about, you know, we've got these environments already, and all we're looking for is for you to show that you can work with animals in those environments in some way, which is, or with plants in their environments for the 3B. I think the key thing around portfolio is fine in terms of formative assessment. The key thing about an outcome is the outcome, they need to demonstrate how they are using their knowledge and skills to meet the outcome. So when you mentioned presentation, I thought, well, yeah, exactly. Get them to come up with, here's a scenario of a business, okay? Based on that scenario of the business, there's clearly a diversification need, or there's a challenge, or there's some kind of issue that they're facing that they need to be able to look at, getting them to decide what is it that they need to do. So they carry out their research to find out what might be suitable for this particular issue. And then for the digital skills, they put together their slide deck where they might have incorporated some images or video clips or something along those lines. And they do an oral presentation, and maybe there's a kind of little bit of a written report, one side that goes with it, that kind of summarizes some of the key points that you could then present to an employer. That would be the kind of holistic assessment of what it is that they're doing. So I think if you're looking at learning, you might want to give them if you're spending the time getting them to learn this content to achieve the outcome, you might want to have different scenarios, and it's a really good opportunity to work with local employers and potentially for them to come in, or using something like Zoom or Teams for them to present, this is my business, this is where we are, this is what we're doing. It doesn't have to be real as long as it's realistic, but if you can get a farmer, or somebody was mentioning a dog groomer or something, you know, so that they learn about the range of different organizations that there are within the sector, you know, rather than them just focused on their own specific area of interest that they have in the September of the year they start. By the end, they've learned more about the sector, which might actually broaden their ideas. And when they go on to the T level and they're learning their core content, they're already familiar with the breadth of the sector and the kind of context and principles and so on that are associated with it. So think about it from that point of view as well. And again, it's not, you're setting the standard. It's not an awarding body standard. So this might be a really quite simple, straightforward little thing where there's a farm, there's a diversification opportunity. You pretty much know what the diversification, you know, turn it into a B&B, you know, grow some flowers and sell them on the corner of the street, you know, have a couple of eggs and put them in a honesty box at the end of the track, whatever it is. I'm just thinking about things that I see locally, you know, where you know it's quite straightforward and all you want them to do is to research, find out some examples and then put that together in their presentation. That's something that's quite simplistic. That's why it's 120 to 150 guided learning hours. Nobody's expecting them to spend 15, 20 hours writing pages and pages and pages. It's not what it's about. Okay, it's just confirming that they can meet these outcomes because they've learned this particular content. So if you can confirm that they can do that through a qualification, that's fine, but just making sure that the qualification does that. And for example, for something like that, you might find for outcome 2, something like the project qualification. So that's available at level 2, the higher project, that's worth half a GCSE, or the extended project qualification, which is a level 3 qualification. So it could be something that towards the end of the year, they could contribute to the level 3 extended project qualification and extend that a little bit further, okay, with that proposed enterprising solutions, because that's the kind of thing that would work well as an extended project. So if you're looking for a qualification, you don't need a qualification to know what to teach them. You know, all of you know what to teach them. Some of you might have difficulty with some of the business because we've talked about this with providers. This is not necessarily something that's in qualifications at the moment, and you might need some business people, but you don't need a qualification to know what to teach. So you don't need to say, and I'll find a unit that's around this that I can add to it. You just teach the content, just teach the stuff, get them to learn. That's all it's about. And each of these outcomes, if it's 120 to 150 in total, they're only kind of 30 to 40 hours maximum. So you're only talking about the equivalent of an hour a week, something like that for each of them, that you're, if you're going to look at what that means in terms of timetable time. So you're looking at 3 hours a week on top of the qualification that you'd be looking at if your qualification doesn't meet those outcomes. So just want to talk more now about the detail that comes under the outcomes. So we start with the outcomes because it's really important when you're choosing a qualification to think about the outcomes and how you're going to meet the outcomes. And if you've chosen a qualification where the assessment requirements don't match the outcomes, that's what I'm saying. Be prepared to talk to your senior leadership team, work out what does that mean in terms of the additional assessment requirements. Remembering that this is about formative assessment, so it's not about a one-off opportunity, but that they can do it many times in order to bring in the content. But looking at the content, so I mentioned the way that it's structured. You've got the overall outline. This is what we're calling the wireframe. So it's kind of stripping back the detail so that you get a sense of what this outcome actually requires in terms of coverage. So the bullet points that are on the screen are the kind of bold headings that you've got under the outcome, under the knowledge, and on the right hand side under the skills. So what we're saying for outcome 2 is they need to learn something about sustainability, and the detail is in there, and that detail came from employers wanted that kind of detail in. So clearly it has to be something about sustainability, the project, otherwise you're not going to be able to cover that heading. Something about ethics. So this is where that kind of notion of professionalism comes in, so that they're not thinking about enterprising solutions that perhaps are unethical. Oh, let's do this with animals. Maybe not quite ethical thing to be able to do. Let's do this with plants and say that they're organic when, you know, they're not quite ethical. And the ethical is because it was something that perhaps at level 2 and 16 don't really understand the concept. So it's an opportunity to introduce them to the concept. Remember, this is not about them having detailed knowledge that they can write reams and reams and reams about. It's about grasping the concept. Do they grasp the concept of ethics and the content that's listed under there? Do they get it? Move on. That's all you're looking at. The supply chain, because if you're looking at business, the supply chain is important. Where is the business in the supply chain? what about the relationships with others in the supply chain? Business as a whole, so they get some kind of business concepts that are included there. Something about finance, because enterprising solutions are great, but if they don't make money and if they make a loss, then that's not going to help them. So them understanding about finance, coming up with solutions that are not financially viable is something that they need to take into account. Information and data, where are they going to get information from? What kind of sources of information, and what are they going to find in those sources of information? So what we're saying is, when you're thinking about your design of the assessment of your outcome, got to look at ways in which you can incorporate that in. So if you've got a case study, if you're working with an employer, getting them to think about something where they can talk about the ethical side of it, just so that you're covering that kind of knowledge, whether it's for a presentation, a short written document that goes alongside what it is that they're doing. So then we look at the skills. Okay, so this is the bit where they're really showing what they're doing. So creativity. I always used to think creativity was about art. So creativity is about thinking. So if you're proposing enterprising solutions, sometimes you've got to be a bit creative. We need to develop creativity. We can't just give them something and say, come up with an enterprising solution. They need the theory, but they need the skill to be able to do that. So what you'll find underneath that heading is it breaks down what that means in terms of the skill. So thinking laterally, thinking about putting things together and coming up with new ideas. Oh, so they do that and they do that. If we put it together, that means they can do something else. So this is all it means in terms of creativity, is thinking differently and looking at how you get them to think differently. Analysing. The number of people that tell me that level 2 students can't analyse, they are so wrong. 5-year-olds analyse. We all analyse all of the time, but they need to learn to analyse, and they need to know when they are analysing so that they can recognise for themselves that they can actually analyse. So again, the skill of analysis and what that means about identifying patterns, identifying relationships. But how are you going to develop that skill in them? And therefore you want evidence of that when they're coming to meet that requirement. Investigate. So research skills, just asking people to research doesn't necessarily develop the skill. All it can do is reinforce poor skills or poor technique. So they need to learn how to research, and they need to develop, and the formative assessment will give them feedback on, maybe you should have tried to do this, maybe if you could do it a different way. So looking at things like how you put a search query into Google so that you don't get 35 million responses, but you look at how you actually refine that search so that you've got better responses within that, how you reference your sources, how you make a note of where you're getting this information from, how you ensure that the source that you're actually going to use has some validity and doesn't come from some conspiracy theorist who may be right, who may be wrong, but actually is from some authoritative source that they've been able to look at. It isn't from something that's 30 years old and they're saying this is what you should do, when there's actually something new, technologically advanced that would work better. So that's what we're looking at. Planning as a skill is really, really important. So teaching them how to plan and using the content of the planning to be able to show them what planning means and how you can do that and how you build that planning skill in. Decision making and how you make decisions and the process that you go through to make decisions, teaching them how to be able to do that, the techniques that they need to be able to do that, giving them opportunity to try out different techniques, getting feedback about the use of the techniques, which bits they've done well, which bits they've not done so well. Communication, we've talked about giving presentations. You can't just ask people to give a presentation tick. They need to learn how to do that, how to change their pitch, their tone, how to consider the language that they're using, how to structure their presentation, using the digital skills to have the kind of support requirements that they need, the support materials that are there. All of this needs to be learned. And these are some of the things in the NTOs that you don't find in qualifications. You might write an assignment and ask them to give a presentation, but often the qualification doesn't have anything about oral communication skills and the skills that are required to give a presentation. You use it as a vehicle, but not necessarily, because there's no time in the qualification to really develop creativity, analysis, research. You get the students to do it, but there's no time within the time for the qual to really get the student to learn. And remember, the whole basis of the transition program is about getting the students to be better learners, because that's usually why they're on the transition program, because when they were at school, they weren't able to demonstrate good learning skills. And we want them to be able to get those so that they're successful when on their T level. So communication, numeracy, digital skills, that they're included in there because they need time to develop. So the 120, 150 guided learning hours, so little of it is needed for the knowledge, to be fair, because it's about grasping the concept. The real time is about the focus on the skills and the time you need to develop the skills. And as people have mentioned, the time you need to develop the behaviors. People don't magically become resilient. People don't magically become self-confident. They need techniques and strategies to enable them to do that. So having those behaviors is saying that by doing this kind of work, there is an opportunity for them to develop these behaviors, and students need to know they're developing the behaviors. They need to get feedback if they're not demonstrating them. They need help with the techniques that they need in order to be able to develop them further. We're not saying they are going to be amazing with these behaviors, but we are looking for them developing these behaviors beyond where they were at the beginning. So going back to the Venn diagram and the diagnostic monitoring and guidance component, the diagnostic isn't getting them to fill in their key skills, their maths and English test. It's about how are their behaviors? What kind of attitudes and positive behaviors have they got at the start? Can you see progress throughout the program because you're developing better attitudes and behaviors because of the way in which you're delivering this? So looking at how you teach this is an important aspect of the delivery of the transition program. So we're going to go into groups again, and Abby's going to, I think there's going to be less groups this time, so we'll put them in. And Carla, Tony and Helen, if you can go in the group that's allocated to Carla, Tony and Helen, that would be great, because you're going to be put in a group with fewer people. And again, just 10 minutes thinking about particularly skills and thinking about teaching and learning. What are your teaching and learning strategies to develop the skills, not to demonstrate the skills? How are you going to get students to be better with their creativity than they were at the beginning, to be better researchers than they were at the beginning, to have better behaviors than they had at the beginning? So it's about what are you going to do in the classroom that are going to make them better than they were when they first started. So you should find that Abby's going to put in on the screen in a minute the opportunity to go into groups. Great. So again, 10 minutes in groups, focusing on teaching and learning. Hi everyone, welcome back. I was able to go into each room, so I could see that here, see, there's a lot of conversation going on. So really keen to kind of get some feedback before we bring this to a close. So we're going to start with room 4, and I believe it's Jordan that's going to speak on behalf of room 4 to talk about some of the kind of key points they were talking about.
Yeah, so we sort of discussed how, from both angles, we talked about the tutor themselves and the student process. So we discussed how the tutor themselves would take on multiple roles throughout the year. So they would actually be the tutor, they would teach, they would be part of the practical consolidation, they'll be a scaffolding, they'll provide the facilitation of teaching, but also become the coach towards the end of the year. And then our foundation really to go with the student teaching is that we'd actually start with a foundation block, utilizing new technologies out there so we don't fall behind and become outdated, and deliver the basics of everything to do first. So the actual theories, the learning methods, the pedagogy of actually learning, so the student is the forefront of the education, and then progressing to delivering the content, then the actual practical consolidation, because that's our specialty in our area, having that resource there. Then we'd actually go into the student-led area. So the student leads their learning, using formative assessments in there. And actually the student becomes reflective because of those core skills that we've developed. So they can see how they're getting on, being reflective in the practice, and then allowing them to study better, see the skill development, and actually see if that T-level progression is going to be something for them. And it's students seeing the final outcome, so what it actually means for progression at the very end. So as James said about the different pathways in equine, showing those different routes allows the learner to see what they actually want to do, or if T-levels is not the right pathway for them. And that was our little bit of delivery there on what we're actually going to do for teaching and learning.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Jordan. It's really interesting because obviously rather than looking at the specifics of how you teach creativity or whatever, you're looking at the whole program and the kind of pedagogical approach that you might use throughout the whole year and how you're scaffolding the learning, which is obviously a really critical thing everybody's looking at now. How we're scaffolding learning, how are we sequencing learning, you know, why have we chosen to sequence it in that way, and how are we getting students to kind of build on their learning, and what is it that it's working towards? So it's really interesting to kind of look at that from a big picture point of view. Anybody got any questions for that group based on the feedback? Okay, let's have a look at what room 3, which was Claire. I think Claire was talking when I came in the room, so I know that there was a lot of discussion there. Claire and Harry, Rachel group. Who's speaking there? Richard, that was your group. Who's best to speak on behalf of that group? Rachel, I think, just take the mic off mute. Great.
Yeah,
Rachel.
sorry, I had to replug my speakers back in.
Yeah.
We sort of went a little off track, I'm not going to lie.
Whatever.
We were talking about trying to individualize the program, because each student's going to need a different skill set development, and we were looking at different ways of doing that, really.
Yeah, and that's the thing, isn't it? You kind of plan a whole program and then think about, well, how can I adapt that to individual student needs? And sometimes that's one of the difficulties with a qualification, when you have to be so driven to covering everything that's on there, that when you're looking at the NTOs particularly, you have a lot more flexibility in terms of how you might use the content to support different people and what it is that they need to learn.
Yeah, I think we agreed that it's nice not to have the constraint of the technical qualification overriding what we know the students need, particularly post-COVID.
And I think that's what a lot of people talk about with the transition program. When they start to see the vision and the fact that this is a different type of study program that's been designed for a very specific purpose, you can then start to look at, well, what does the qualification mean within that? And that's where I was starting at the beginning. Do we need such a big qual, when actually what these students need to prepare them for a T-level or level 3 learning is perhaps something not so focused on getting a really big qualification achieved, where you've got that kind of pressure all the time of having to meet these requirements, because of course the T-level has all predominantly endpoint assessment, so they've not got that ongoing summative assessment all the time, so it's not necessarily preparing them for what is needed. And then when you get on the T-level and the student says, do I need that for my assignment? Well, no, you haven't got an assignment. Your assignment comes at the end of the second year. So getting them to kind of think, the student to think differently about what they're learning and why they're learning. So also, we know we've only got 2 hours. We try and have these breakouts, so you've got the opportunity to network and talk to each other, but obviously it's quite limited. So we know that you're using the opportunity to find out what other people are doing, and that's entirely right. And we know that that's going to happen. It's unfortunate we don't have those 15 minutes by the coffee machine opportunities to just kind of chat, walking along the corridor as you're going into the breakout rooms to do an activity, to have that kind of general chat, chatting over lunch. We don't have that time. We're going to talk in a minute about where we will have that time if you want to join us, but we don't necessarily at the moment. Let's have a look at room 2, which had Caroline, Kirsty, Lucy, and Nick was the AOC facilitator. We've got someone there that's going to tell us briefly what they were talking about.
Kirsty, I don't know if you want to talk about what you said about your City and Guilds technicals. That was quite interesting. Yeah, we were talking about holistic delivery, and actually we're not. Although what I've very much seen today is it's quite exciting way of sort of switching things up on what we're already doing. But I do feel, and myself and Lucy are both at Rees, the way that we deliver our curriculum and have done so for the past 3 or 4 years now, is that all of our sessions are what we call synoptic 1, synoptic 2, and we very much deliver our whole qual with that holistic nature in mind. And we've seen that it's had a really positive impact on how students have achieved, because they see the link between that unit and that unit. And within that itself, we also have study skills sessions where we look at embedding how to study, how to put a presentation together, all of those elements. But that's also embedded into all of our lessons as well. So if a tutor is launching a project, we talk about skills for research and things like that. So I think in terms of the holistic nature of delivery, that sits very well with this. It's something that we're quite used to. It's just about, I think what I'm taking from today is I can very much see, and James is on this course as well, I can see that there's more opportunity for us to deliver cross college, cross departments, where we have agriculture, we have equine, and there's a lot of commonality here that we can't really do at the moment with our current quals. So yeah, and that's what we were talking about.
Okay, thanks, Kirsty. Yeah, we know that there are providers out there that are using a lot of the ideas, because the framework for delivery and the whole idea of the transition programme didn't come from policy civil servants. It came from providers. So we had a series of focus groups probably 4 years ago now, where we worked with providers saying, what is good learning? What do these students that are not yet ready for a T-level need as part of their programme? So lots of providers who are already doing good practice, innovative practice, were able to feed into and show the DFE what good could look like, and therefore what this programme needs to look like. And like you were saying, Kirsty, a lot of providers then look at the framework for delivery and say, well, what's new about that? It's what we're already doing. But there are providers that haven't necessarily moved that way yet, or their thinking has been supporting learners quite well, doing something that's quite different. So we acknowledge that some people are already doing this, so that's fantastic from that point of view. And now everybody knows that Rees Heath, and I'll say it's Rees Heath that are doing this. That's the people that you might want to talk to in the future and network with. And I'm sure there are other providers, and I know, Helen, when you were talking about, or the three of you there, when you were talking about your group and the business. So Havant and South Downs are one of the ones that were part of the development of the framework for delivery, because you've been running transition programme from the very beginning. So there's a lot of innovative practice across a number of providers already that it's worth looking at. And that's part of what the AOC can do. They're offering these insight days where you can go into providers and learn more about what they're doing, what kind of good practice, and having that quite early on, and it is still quite early on in terms of planning for your transition programme. There's a lot of opportunity to learn from what other people are doing. So let's just hear from the final room, room 1. Just leaving the 18 till last then, are we?
Hi.
Go for it.
We were talking a little bit about what's already been said, but also about getting employers involved and having sort of employers come in to do interview practice for students and give them feedback similar to the T-level partner board that they have, and also having somebody from our group was talking about linking with the apprenticeship team that they have at the college, and looking at how they are currently assessing their students and how we can benefit from that for the T-level transition programme. And then something that at our college we're thinking of doing is things like having masterclasses from sort of people in our digital team, for example, to give them some digital skills.
Yeah, so quite a few have talked about that kind of more whole organization approach and going wider than perhaps the team that you're normally used to working with, and looking at the expertise that might be available within the college or your organization as a whole, and how they can help either to prepare you to plan, how they can support your own CPD, or how they can be involved in the delivery going forward, either because they've got contacts, because they've got expertise, or because they've got something else, the equipment or something like that that they can use and they can share. So I think it's quite interesting that some of you are talking about that kind of wider organization and kind of reaching out and finding out what other people are doing. And again, your advisors can very much help with that, but so can your transition lead or your T-level lead. So if you're not already in contact with your T-level lead or your transition lead, I recommend that you do make contact and find out what they've got planned, what their thinking is around this. If there's, we were on a call with catering, nobody knew anybody else that was doing anything to do with T-levels or transition program within their organization, but the advisors knew, and that there was a lot going on. So finding out what is going on locally is as important as coming to these events and finding out what other providers are doing, because there's probably some really good practice going on already, like Kirsty was talking about. We've only got a few minutes left, so thank you everyone for your feedback. I just want to go through the last few bits. Just to point out, the main bit of the NTOs is your minimum content, the section on breadth and depth. So just pointing out, there's two columns, one that's about breadth, one that's about depth. The phrasing that's used is the phrasing that's used in T-levels and the assessment objectives for the core content. So if you start thinking about using the breadth and depth, what you're doing again is preparing students for T-levels. So the breadth is the application of knowledge. So it's about moving away from regurgitating the textbook, paraphrasing the handout, to actually using their understanding of the concepts in specific situations and contexts. So giving them lots of different situations and contexts so that they can apply that knowledge. That's what will prepare them for their T-level. That's what they call the AO2 part of the content. The AO3 is the second bullet point there, analysing information and ideas from across context to draw conclusions and make judgments. So that's not just about asking them to analyse or asking them to evaluate, it's about giving them information. So AO2 is more or less, here's a situation, what will you do about it? AO3 is, here's some information, what's the problem? So AO2 defines the problem, AO3 is, can you work out what the problem is? And then can you use your knowledge and understanding in order to be able to resolve and come up with suggestions for those kinds of issues and problems. So when you're looking at your depth and breadth, clearly the depth is very much about the taxonomy of moving them, stretching them, thinking about moving them towards higher level learning. Level 2 is very much about routine, straightforward, discrete, clear, familiar contexts. Level 3, bringing in complexity, bringing in unfamiliar. And therefore, as you're moving them towards preparing for a T-level, towards the end of their transition program, maybe sometimes talking about something they've not learned about, or they've not expressed interest in, so that they can start to see about, actually, when I've learned about all of this, can I use it in this particular situation? Can I see the similarities? Do I understand what's going on? So I just now briefly want to talk about next steps, because we've had this 2-hour online session. What we're wanting to do is have a full day face-to-face session next term. So these are going to be regional so that they are more accessible to you rather than route specific. But that means that we can accommodate lots of different routes at these events. So hopefully they are within easy travel time for you if you can get the time for the day to come, because this is when you will have lots of time at lunch to network, coffee break time, which you didn't get today, apologies, when you can network, time when you arrive where you can network, when you can hand out your cards, when you can hand out your email addresses, where you can follow up and you can learn from each other. And we're going to spend more time looking at the NTOs in more detail, and in particular the route-based project part of the technical knowledge and skills component. Okay, so it'd be great if you were able to join, and you'll find details on the events page, and the colleague Abby, when she sends out details about where you find the slide deck and everything, there'll also be the link to where you can find these. You can see that there's a couple of venues still to be decided. So if you consider yourself to be central, Hales Owen, I do, or south, Havant and South Downs, I do, and you want to be able to host an event, that would be great to, if you think that you can. So we'll be looking for a big room where we can have lots of kind of breakout tables for people to work in. So they'll be very much based around a little bit of information, but a lot of activity and producing outputs. So you're actually going to sit with pen and paper and produce something that you can share with everybody else who's at the meeting and everybody else who comes to the other meetings. Just to let you know that we're going to have another one in June, also face-to-face, also regional, where we're looking much more at holistic delivery and how you can bring in the maths, English, digital skills and the core skills and behaviours as well into your NTOs further than we're doing already. So very much around focusing on technical knowledge and how you're going to bring all of this so that the NTOs are the hook upon which everything else is going to be hung. So you should find on your screen that there's a feedback survey. It's got 6 questions, but they're all kind of click box questions. So really appreciate if you could fill that in before you go. I know I've kept you 1 minute longer than we were scheduled to do. Apologies for that. I'm happy to stay around if people want to ask me any specific questions. And I'm not sure about the advisors and whether they can or whether they've got other things to go to. But if you're not around, thank you so much for your time today. I know there was somebody who had the Santa hat on. Christmas is coming, apparently. Not necessarily the snow, although I know some people have got it. Have a fantastic break. I'm sure you know you deserve it. Relax, enjoy it. And hopefully I get to see some of you, especially South and Central, at those events next term. I'd really look forward to it. So thank you all. Free to leave. Lovely speaking to you. Lovely seeing you. But if people want to see me, they can do. Thank you.